did a survey recently on my channel. The survey had to do with what kind of videos do you want to see, and there were 4 options. One of them was doing a kind of a fast speed video and then doing commentary behind it. So I'm not going to bother with going through the process and all that stuff. I'm going to actually talk behind this video. This is a tub to shower conversion, which I do pretty frequently, and it is standard builder's grade 4x4 tile. Been up here for a good part of 20 years. Blah 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 blah.
After the tear out, which you saw kind of crappily, I began the build back process. And I start with the niche, almost always. So kind of I move from the carpentry phase to the plumbing phase, and then the build back, the prep part proper. The niche is built with 2x4s. I usually do it on the rear wall, meaning the longest wall. In this case, I'm doing it on the back wall, opposite the shower head. That's where the customer wanted it. And I do the cutout of the stud in between. And a lot of people will feel like it needs a king and a jack and header and all that stuff, especially on that rear wall, or the back wall rather, because it's usually a load-bearing exterior wall. But I have talked to framers, and they said that, yeah, there's no harm, no foul for one stud like that. As I put the lateral, the horizontal studs in between, then I kind of figure out the math on the vertical studs that I'm hammering in right now and leveling out to find out what size they're going to be. I usually try and get it somewhat center, and I think I accomplished that here. But I'm using different levels because I think this was shorter, ended up being shorter than my 2-foot level that you saw earlier. So I kind of cross-check with these other little cruddy levels that I've had for a while, these 1-foot levels. And then I'm using 3-inch deck screws. Sometimes I use a framing nailer, but I got to set up the compressor and the hose and all that stuff. So in this case, it was a condo and I didn't want to drag all that stuff in, so I'm using deck screws on this. And I'm constantly checking level, and I'm constantly making sure that everything is going to be the same size. So I do a measurement, usually top and bottom, left to right, make sure that that's exactly within, a 1/16 of an inch or so, and I do the same thing from top to bottom to make sure that that's also, because I just want it as good as possible. There's some manipulation with that niche later on with the thin set and the tile, but the prep matters because I know I'm going to be tiling it, so I'm trying to get it down as good as I can. What I'm doing here is I'm getting ready to do the blocking between the studs at the bottom for the pan liner to rest up against. And I ran into a pipe, I think it was a stack, and so I'm just notching out this 2x6 so I can fashion it in around where that pipe is at. The blocking, I'm going to say it's necessary. I started doing it when I started doing showers because I never saw it before, so I kind of integrated it into my work, and it just kind of it gives somewhere for your pan liner to rest up against, and that's why I do the blocking. And I usually try and get it pretty tight, as you can tell here, 1/16 or so over what the measurement is, so that it fits in there really well. And then I do the toenail fasteners left and right on the top, and again sometimes with framing nails, and in this case I was doing it with the 3-inch deck screws. When I get to the front portion where the supply line is at, I think on this shower I didn't show it, but on this shower I actually used some plywood. No, I didn't show it on here, but unfortunately on the video I missed that part. But where those lines were that I was just touching, there's only maybe on that bottom 2x4, there's maybe a 1/2 inch. And so yeah, I just take some plywood and I glue it in, same as I'm gluing in this piece here, which I'm gluing in that piece because there's nowhere on the left side. You see that pipe there, there's nowhere on this left side to anchor it. So it's anchored, toenailed on the right, but now I'm gluing in something to support it in the back, and then I put some shims in it too to kind of bump it out and get it flush with that bottom plate. And then on the left side there, later on, I'm using some plywood, and I kind of do the same thing. I glue all 3 sides, left, right, bottom, with some construction adhesive, and that sets it in there good enough. And I do that frequently because sometimes that pipe is so close to the front that you really can't do it any other way. 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch ply, 3/8 ply. The carpentry portion, as I said, I usually knock out first, and this is another phase of that. When you cut out the old wall and the tile and all that stuff, inevitably you end up with a gap between the stud and the sheetrock. So, yeah, theoretically you could cut back the sheetrock another, inch or 2 inches or whatever, and fashion the stud in there sideways, a 2x4. But what I usually do is what I'm doing here, which is a 1x4. Because it fits in there relatively easy. Sometimes you kind of lose it inside of the wall like I just did there, and then you have to fish it out. But I always have a screw screwed into the bottom of that, and then I just kind of dig it back out, and I line it up flush with that 2x4 on the right side. And then I run a bunch of screws into the sheetrock and into the 1x4. That way it's stable and it's anchored to that sheetrock. So when I put my wallboard to, kind of marry up to that existing wallboard, not only are they flush, but I have something solid to then screw the wallboard into. And it makes it really easy peasy where you don't have to cut out excess sheetrock that's not necessary. I think this was an 8-foot piece that I had to cut down to less than 6 foot and put the larger piece up on the top, and then I think I had about another foot left that I had to put down at the bottom because I wanted that raised up, that piece raised up that I'm touching there, about 4 or 5 inches past that top of the stud, so that when I come in with my screws, which I'm doing right there, that I have enough of that 1x to screw into, so I have a good solid anchoring of that piece of wood. And then I think I kind of jump over to the curb at this point. Yeah, I'm still fashioning in that piece, trying to find one that'll fit, and then cutting off the excess. God, that tool right there, which I just by default call a Dremel, and of course there's many manufacturers, that's probably one of my favorite and most useful tools in this business. It does so much work for me. Just quick cuts like that. I can use it to undercut door jambs when I'm doing floor tile. I can use it to cut pipe. I mean, it's multifunctional, and probably my most used tool besides my screw gun. But getting onto the curb, there's no way I can center my drain and do my plumbing work and all that stuff without having done that. So I'm going to move on to that later, but I think I'm getting into the plumbing next. I think I'm getting into cutting out the old valve. And I believe on this job my customer wanted to learn how to sweat pipe, because I think I'm one of the anomaly guys out there that still sweat pipe that haven't moved over to PEX. This tool here is awesome. I think it's a Husky brand, but you just keep on turning it and turning it and turning it. It clamps on. It's got one opening. It clamps on. You just keep turning it until the pipe is fully cut. A lot better than the turn the bottom. Well, a lot of people that do copper will know what I'm talking about. Those old-fashioned ones where you turn the bottom, then twist the tool, and then turn the bottom and twist the tool. No, this one's much, much better. Makes fast work of getting out all the plumbing you don't need. Anytime you work with water, shut down the water. It should go without saying, but I have to say it anyway. I always shut down the water. Make sure that I don't have any issues with a pipe exploding in my customer's house. I'm cleaning off, I'm just sanding off the ends because I know I'm going to be attaching connectors right there. That's not where my valve is going to go. It's going to go right there. And so that's where I cut it. I cut it exactly where I'm going to need it for the new valve going up that standpipe to the shower head. And so I'm just doing all of the prep work right now because I'm going to eventually dry fit all that copper before I ever get to the point of sweating the pipe. So all my 90s, all my connectors, all of that stuff, including my valve itself, gets all prepped and sanded and get some flux on it. Do all my measurements, all my cutting, and all that stuff. And there's my customer standing behind me, trying to learn how to do all this stuff. So yeah, there's a mud cap on there, that green plastic thing, that's a mud cap, and I'm going to get into that in just a second. Also, you're going to take out the cartridge that has to do with that brass body of that valve. That cartridge is plastic and rubber, and there I'm going to pull it out with some channel locks. Set that aside. That doesn't go back in until everything's sweated, because you will melt that and not have a good day. Right, so that brass valve, because it's brass, I always start my sweating. I'll get to that little talk once I get my torch out and all that stuff. But you want to start from the bottom, wherever your furthest point is with sweating pipe. Start from that end, because by the time you get to that brass valve, it needs a lot more heat than does copper. So you're kind of almost preheating that brass valve by the time you get there with your fire. So yeah, it just makes life a lot easier. And then I'm just cutting off the extra pipe that I need to bring those hot and cold lines up. Also, I tend to oversweat, because having been in the apartment business years ago and having to shut down a building just to make a repair or change out a valve or something like that, you find out that you have a very small pinhole leak. You turn the whole building back on, and then you realize, uh-oh, I got a pinhole leak, and then you got to shut the building down. It's a big pain. So what I started doing by default many years ago is I oversweat. Yes, I use much more solder than I need to, and it looks sloppy, and I don't care. A lot of plumbers who do it on a day-to-day basis know exactly how much that they need, and they make it very clean, and they rub it off with a little scouring pad and make it nice and pretty. And then you put wallboard on it, and you'll never see it. So I'm more of the practical side of it, just making sure that I don't have any issues when I turn the water back on. So I'm just applying flux to all of my sanded pieces. And the flux makes it possible for when you put the heat on the pipe, it kind of cleans the pipe, but also makes it possible for all of that solder to kind of get sucked into the area that you want it sucked into. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about briefly, before I fire up my torch, I'm going to talk briefly about that mud cap, and I'll get to that too, because that's coming up here pretty soon. The mud cap is an integral part of your shower valve system, and it comes in the box. Don't throw that plastic part away, because it will be your parameter on your finished wall. I think most of them allow for about an inch. I think they're about an inch thick or so. So you have some play room from the very back of that mud cap to the very front, but ultimately your finished wall should meet up with the front or the back of that mud cap, and that's why you don't throw it away. It serves that purpose as well as protecting, your valve body and all that stuff as you're working. So yeah, I'm actually anchoring the pipe down. I got a little piece of scrap wood, and I just stuck it in that hole where that pipe comes out of the ground so that it's anchored very well. Don't use anything else but wood, because you will mess up that pipe. And here's where I fire up the torch. You're actually heating the connector right in the center of the connector. You're not heating up and down where the pipe is at, because you want that heat, you want the solder to travel to the heat. So therefore, that's where it goes. And I'm usually doing the bottom part first and then the top part. And as I said, I've got a flashlight and a mirror. Yeah, because I always want to check all my connections. And I think a little bit later you're going to see on that 90 to the right that I have to re-sweat. I have to re-sand and sweat, because I'm not wasn't comfortable. There was a hole showing or something like that. I wasn't comfortable with it. But you see how I started from the bottom, worked my way up to those 90s. I'm putting heat squarely on the elbow of that 90 and letting the solder kind of get sucked in to this directions. And by that time, now I can go to the valve proper, because it's preheated and it makes life easier to have that preheat thing going on. Because copper is obviously harder to heat up than, or sorry, brass is harder to heat up. And there's a flashlight in the mirror again, checking all my connections, and I think this is where I saw a suspect hole, which I wasn't sure about. So what I did is I sanded it off a little bit, added a little bit more flux to it, and then went ahead and fired up the torch and took care of that. And of course, when I turned on the water, I didn't have any leaks, which 99.9% of the time I never do. But yeah, it's a pain in the ass to shut down. And this is a condo, so it would have required, potentially shutting down, maybe 6 units or 8 units, and inconvenience a lot of people. So an hour and a half or so later, you see I'm putting in the cartridge again. You could sponge it off. You could put some water on it. There's a lot of ways you can do that. Also, you notice I got a little burn mark on the drywall there, as well as the wood down at the bottom that I'm going to eventually take off anyway, because that's for anchoring. Oh, I'm explaining to my customer the inside portion and the outside portion of that mud cap and why it's there and why you need it. But yeah, I carry a piece of scrap metal that I think I took off of some type of an appliance, and I carry that in my truck so that I'm not having burn marks and stuff like that going on that you just saw. And I always do my sweating first thing in the day. As you see, I started back behind me with the niche, built that out, kind of moved on from there, and then I got to the sweating part. So it's the first hour or two of my day. I don't want a sweat pipe at the end of the day. I don't want to be thinking overnight whether or not, like the house is burnt down, whether or not there's an ember, or I heated up something that I shouldn't have. So yeah, that's kind of the whole plumbing part of the valve. Not much more I can tell you on that, except that I'm doing the anchoring now. They have copper straps that I'm screwing into that piece of 2x4 that I stuck in there. That you saw, the other piece of 2x4 was also an anchoring piece of wood that I ended up taking out. So when you're doing your anchoring, you've also measured the distance sideways. You put a scrap piece of sheetrock up to that mud cap there, and know that, okay, I've got half an inch of sheetrock, and then I've got another 3/8 tile, a little bit of thin set, and there I'm marking and making sure that my mud cap is sticking out far enough to accommodate the backer board and the tile. So now I'm getting ready to fashion the curb in, the first piece of the curb, as it were, because that's the only way I can ascertain where my drain is going to go, because I want my drain as center as possible. So I'm making sure left and right the measurement is correct. If it's 32 1/4 on one end, I want it 32 1/4 on the other end. And then I mark it, because as I screw it down from one end to the other, it might move. So a little pencil mark there, a little pencil mark there. And then I can toenail some of those deck screws into the board that's adjoining. Same thing over here, toenail into that board. And I always do that with all three, because I've seen curbs that were not anchored in that fashion, and for all intents and purposes, they're not anchored. They're only anchored to the floor, so they can move back and forth, front and back. And so I'm adamant about anchoring them as many times as possible. I think I use 8 screws. I think there's 10 screws, 2 on each side, and then a couple of screws, maybe 5-6 inches apart, all the way across. Make sure you have level, which it is. Double check that by the second, double check that by the third. Now the only exception to that is if you decide that you want, and your curb should be sloped inward, so that when your tile is finally put on, that the water sheds off of your curb into the shower. So some people like to put some shims in the front side of that curb before they screw it down. Maybe about 4 or 5 or 6 shims to kind of give you a little bit of a slope going on, going into your shower. I don't do it that way. I actually slope with my tile, but there's a hint. This is another one too. That 2x4 was warped, and it was warped in such a way the only thing I could do was like put that 2x4 there and then put like as many tools as I could to kind of push that, which is pushing on the top of that curb, so that I could anchor that top piece down. And I'm just shoving everything inside of there that I can. Now that the warp is gone, I can run some screws in there and solidly have that second piece of curb top in. And of course, I also toenail that piece as well as this last and third piece. I'm looking at the end. The grain of the wood should be facing down. My grandfather taught me that years ago, and I've just always adhered to that. So you have a little circular grain of wood, and I always make sure that circular part's facing down. And then same thing, toenail right into that scabbing that I have, so that you have a solid anchored piece of curb going on. And then of course I put a level on it and all that stuff. So going forward, now that I know that my curb is where it's going to be, now I can figure out the math on my drain. And I want to jump ahead to that drain while you see the screwing thing going on. So the drain itself is 1.5 inches because it was a tub, and it's going to be converted to a shower. So if you can, go as far as you can up under the subfloor when you're doing transition. Sometimes you can't, but at the end of the day it doesn't really matter, but the transition should be as far back as possible. And in this case I was limited with my room, so just off to the right there where the drain is at is where I eventually cut, and you'll see that in a minute. Right now I'm just kind of centering up exactly where my drain is going to land, and it's center left to right and front to back. So I'm just drawing out a line because eventually I got to cut out that swath of plywood to make that happen. And then I'm kind of figuring out the cross section of where the flange is going to end up getting anchored to the floor. Anyway, getting back to that 1.5 inches to a 2-inch drain, you don't want to put that P-trap down where it was. You want to bring it out. You want to bring it out, as far as you can, because you want that P-trap directly under your drain. This saw blade was really weak. I need a new saw blade on my skill saw, and it kicked up a lot of smoke. And so you're going to see in a second here, I'm going through the house, opening the doors and all that stuff because the smoke alarm went off. And that's where my drain is, right where that cross is. Yeah, this is where I open the door. Front door and back door. Let the wind come through, shut off that smoke alarm, and get back to work. And here is my Dremel tool again, oscillating tool if you will. So awesome, I love that thing. So I'm cutting out right where the P-trap starts, and you're going to see in a minute where I fashion in and do a dry fit of the new P-trap. And as I said before, don't have the P-trap right there. Ideally you want the P-trap right below where your drain is going to be. Yeah, there's excess water in that P-trap, get rid of that for sure. And that is a weld P-trap, by the way. It's not the screw type. Weld meaning that it's going to be glued in and not screwed. They do have those connectors that you can screw those, and I don't use those. And so once I get the parameter and I know how far out there I'm doing the measurement, that's where the P-trap is going to set. And then eventually I'll glue in the connector. So that's what that is I have in my hand right now. That transitions 1.5 inches to 2 inch. It's called a hub, and that hub gets glued in first, and then all the rest of the pipe, I've got a 90 and then a long piece of pipe, and then the P-trap is right there where I want it. And I didn't show all that gluing process because it's pretty easy. Right there you see the hole opening. I've got 2x4s that my hand is on, left, right, front, and back. And I screw those in from the top. And I bring those the longer 2x4s back about another 3-4 inches past where you see it on the floor. And then run down my, oh yeah, I'm checking my level on my pipe there. Make sure I got my 1/4 inch per foot. Yeah, that's how I get a stable subfloor when I have to do the cutting through the subfloor, is that I just put in the scabbing 2x4, 2x6, whatever I have on hand, but I run it past where my knees are at currently. I just feel better about having run it past that, and then I put in the cross sections front and back, and then I'm good to go. And then the next step is just cutting out the holes exactly where my cross was at earlier that you saw. And I get a compass out and I make this circular pencil mark of exactly, I think that bottom flange is about 4.5 inches. So with that circular pencil mark that I have on there, I know now that I can run a couple of holes, I think 4 holes, so that it accommodates a Sawzall blade. And if you had a jigsaw, I haven't had a jigsaw for years and years and years, but if you had one, it'd probably make life easier for you. By default, I always use the Sawzall wood cutting blade. And this is where I'm actually doing the drilling of the hole. I'm centering up where the drain is going to be first. And there's my compass. I'm doing the measurement. I think that's 4.5 inches from the bolt recess to the bolt recess. It's about 4.5. Or maybe it's 5, I forget. And there's my compass. I'm making my mark, making sure that I have the exact fit that's going to go on with that bottom flange. Because right there, I'm literally where you saw the P-trap come up. That's the center mark. And then I run a couple of paddle bit. I think that's like probably a 1/2 inch paddle bit. And then I just put 4 holes in there to accommodate the blade, and then I cut from hole to hole. I have a circle, and then I shore up that circle, and then I do a taper cut with my Sawzall blade, because there's a taper on the bottom of that flange. There's a taper that I want to follow on my wood, and so I'll cut a little taper on top of my wood so that it fits in there nice and snug. And then there's 4 holes on that bottom flange where your screws anchor that flange into the wood, and then you're pretty much done with that phase of the plumbing. So yeah, I've talked ahead of what I'm doing so that you'll understand what's going on. And then of course I'm dry fitting. Right, as I said, right below there is where my P-trap comes up, and I'm dry fitting, making sure that that pipe that I stuck in the bottom flange is the exact size I want it. And then I'm doing the taper cuts with the blade. But yeah, that covers all the carpentry, the building of the niche, the scabbing between everything that you saw. It covers the curb material, so all of that goes first. And I'm doing the plumbing, as you saw earlier, putting in a new valve. Now I'm doing the plumbing as far as the drain goes. And that's basically it, putting the primer on, putting the glue on, setting it in there, and then gluing on the cap. And that's all part of it. The next phase is going to be all the wallboard and the waterproofing, and then pouring the pan itself. And that will probably be on the next video. I'm trying not to make these videos extremely long. This one's already 30 minutes, and I think the attention span fades after 30 minutes. So it'll probably be another 30-minute video with the prep portion. And I don't believe I filmed the tile portion, but if I didn't, I'll put that on another video at some point. Or I might marry these videos together, have an 1.5-hour video. I don't know. Put it in the comments section. What would you rather? Would you rather have like these full build videos one at a time, part 1, part 2, part 3, or do you want to see all parts and pick and choose what part you want to watch? Tell me in the comment section what you would like. So I'm screeding out some thin set, where all the wood joins together for no reason whatsoever. Nobody will ever see that. All the boogering up of the plywood I'm doing also. There's no reason for that. I'm doing it because I want it nice and neat, nice and flush and neat and pretty, that nobody will ever see. Yeah, I know. It's weird. You don't need to do it. I did it on here. I just, whatever. Maybe I had time to. So now that I have the basic prep done with all the wood, I'm going to focus this video on the pan liner and the mortar. So it won't be as long as the upcoming videos, or as the last one for that matter, but I think this kind of needs a standalone video by itself, because DIYers, homeowners, get confused by this process. The pan liner is a PVC type material. You can get it at Lowe's, Home Depot, any tile store has this. It is very, very tough. You're not going to perforate it very easily, although, keep sharp objects away from it. And it's usually best to have it in a warm environment. If you can put it out in the sun in the summertime, or in the wintertime, if you put a space heater and put it in a bathroom or something like that, it makes it more pliable and much easier to wrap around the curb, as I'm doing there, and wrapping the corners. I do generally sometimes refer to as a hospital fold in the corners, and a lot of homeowners get a little intimidated by that, because there's going to be a bump out. You could theoretically, and other tile guys will do it. Let me speak to this first, because I think I'm getting ready to do some caulking. On that bottom flange, there's a little rim. It's an indentation of a rim, and once you get your pan liner situated in such a way that you're going to be setting it, that's at the time you would run the bead of caulking right on that ridge, and you'll see it here in a second. So this is a white silicone. You could use clear. I always use white because I want to be able to see what I'm doing. You're running that on there specifically if the drain ever backs up, and you don't want it going on to your plywood, your subfloor, or whatever, because you will be perforating the top of that shower pan liner. That if the drain ever backs up, that it won't get past that little ring of caulking that you put there, and that's the reason you have it there. So you gotta kind of work around that. As I'm moving around the pan, you'll see that I'm avoiding that particular area, because yes, I want it squished down as I'm putting the pan liner on it, but I don't want it moved around in such a way to, like make it all messy and all that stuff. So yeah, I just kind of push it down at that point, and then I start putting my fasteners up the wall. So getting back to what I was going to say earlier about the corners and the folds that I'm getting ready to do. If you have an ability, like between those two studs that you see in the corner, if you have an ability to get a Dremel in there, or somehow get a gap fashioned out into that corner, then you don't really have to do these folds. You can just push the excess pan liner right into that corner where my left hand is at. Just push the excess pan liner into that crevice that you created. Problem I have is that 99% of the time there's two studs that are conjoined, like in that corner, whether it's in front of me or off to the side. There's usually a couple studs that eliminate the possibility of me ever putting my pan liner in the corner. And I don't know, I feel a certain way about it kind of flopping around inside of there. I don't know what's going on, so I'm generally not doing it. I've done it a few times, but as a rule I'm doing these folds, and I always do my folds the same direction on that back wall. Just out of habit, I'm not doing it that fold that direction, and then on the other end doing it to the shorter end of the pan. I always do the longer end and do my folds there, and then I have to do the folds at the curb too, which I'm going to get to. I'm putting my fasteners as high up as I can, and in this case I have a pretty good size height wise of my shower pan liner, but I'm kind of relegated sometimes to go down to that, basically the 6.5 inch mark, where my in between the studs, I have fashioned in some scabbing of 2x6, so I'm right at the top of that 2x6 where I'm drilling in right there. And then, yeah, getting that real tight into the corner. If there's not anything solid to drill into, and the reason why I put that scabbing in 2x6 is I want something solid for the pan to rest up against, but also ultimately I need something solid for my liner to drill into. Some guys prefer nails. They'll use perhaps roofing nails, or they'll use drywall type nails to tack that up. I've seen other guys use staples. Yeah, I suppose you could use staples, but given the option of screws or nails, I don't know why somebody would use staples, but you know, you could theoretically do that. You're trying to get that fold in there as tight as possible so that it's pulling on the pan liner, so you have a nice even surface going across all the sides that you're dealing with. And in theory, you could go from stud to stud, and that's all the fasteners that you need. You don't really have to go down to that scabbing, top of the scabbing. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It really depends on the job that I'm at. This is where it gets a little tricky, because I'm doing the same type of fold you see on the inside rather than the outside. I always like my folds on the inside. And it gets a little tricky here because I only have two hands, so I have to be able to hold up the pan liner in a straight up direction like that and know exactly where I'm going to be screwing into that to hold that corner up, and then be able to do a nice even cut with my razor knife for the rest of that pan liner to wrap over the curb. And I'm doing it from the inside, so I'm kind of touching and feeling where the top of the curb is at, and then I'm going as closest to that left side as possible with my cut and hope for the best. I'm pretty tight right there. Sometimes I'm not so tight, maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch off, but at the end of the day, by the time you wrap the curb with wallboard and you wrap your walls with wallboard, that little gap wouldn't matter. It would hardly matter at all. So I don't overly concern that I'm not really tight with that cut, but I try and get as tight as possible. And the only way to do that is to fashion up where I'm doing right now first before I do any cutting. Because if you cut wrong, it's not going to be a good day. And then, yeah, you just let the excess kind of just flop down over the curb. You'll see a little later on, I'm only pouring the pan on this video, but in the next video you're going to see where I fashion my wallboard around that curb, where I've taken my pan liner and put it over the curb, ostensibly to protect the curb from water. But that is the last line of defense. It is definitely not my first line of defense. So the fact that I actually perforate that curb material, that liner, later on with my wallboard, some people freak out about, well, why are you protecting your curb with the pan liner, but then you just perforate it with your screws later on? And my retort is, that is not my line of defense. My first line of defense is the tile, and normally, if I can, one of those contiguous curb tops, you know, a piece of marble 6 inches wide and cut it down to size. That's my first line of defense. My second line of defense is the waterproofing, the Red Guard, Aqua Defense, Hydroban, anything that I'm putting on that, even if I've got Curdy on it, that would be my second line of defense. Then my third line of defense, if all else fails, would be that pan liner that I've wrapped around the curb. But if you're counting on your pan liner to be your moisture defense, then you've already done it wrong, because if water ever gets to that point of the pan liner, you've already messed up. So that's why I call that the third line of defense. And then a lot of people advocate for putting the corners, they're perforated type of corners that are meant to fashion into the left and the right side, dam corners, if you will. I don't use the dam corners, but I'll get to that in the next video. Here I'm cutting an X. I'm not going exactly from edge to edge of the opening of that drain, just shy of the edge. I'm putting an X in there. A lot of people will cut a circle. I don't understand the reason why they would cut a circle when they have an ability to cut an X. Now I'm just reaching up under there and finding where the bolt holes are, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm cutting an X. All 4 of those bolt holes get an X, and it's a very tight X. So I want the body of my bolt to snugly fit into that X when I push it down into the hole. I've been doing it that way since the first time I built a shower. I've never understood cutting a circle, because eventually when I put the second flange, the locking flange that you see at the bottom of that barrel of the drain, when I push that down there, it's going to push the flaps of that X down into the drain. So it makes it even better, in my mind, if there is a backup, that you're not relying solely on that bead of caulking you saw earlier to keep water out. You're also relying on part of that pan liner that gets pushed down into the down position with that locking flange that I'm setting in there now. So yeah, you want a nice tight fit and pushing down and then turning it into those recesses for the bolts. And then yeah, getting those bolts really, really tight. I don't know if I show it or not, but I think you can see where the 4 flaps of the pan liner go inside of the drain. Because that flange, that locking flange, does have a bit of a girth. I think it's probably about 2 inches or so that go down into the drain. And then I'm backing off of the drain in the left way fashion in order to hear a click, knowing that I have my threads exactly the way they should be. And my screws are lined up in one direction. I don't know why I'm focused on that. That's about an inch and generally an inch and a quarter to an inch and a half tops. That's another question I get a lot. Oh, there I'm showing where my screws are lined up. It's an OCDC thing. You know, it's like my screws should be lined up front to back or left to right. But yeah, that's a question I get a lot. How thick should my mortar be around the barrel of the drain? I've never measured it, but I think I did there just for the purpose of this video, and it ends up being about an inch and a quarter. And I got about a 2-foot span on the left to the right. It's a 5-foot shower, so about 2.5 feet from the center of that drain to that either the left or the right. Which, if I'm at say an inch and a quarter inch per foot from my mortar at the perimeter in that direction, would get me roughly 2.5 feet. Yeah, about another half an inch, say 3/4 of an inch added on to that inch and a quarter. So yeah, you're right at about 2 inches at the perimeter, more or less. And it really depends on, you know, the configuration of the shower. Some of them are not elongated like that is, you know, some of them are square, say a 4 foot by 4 foot square or whatever. But the gist is that about an inch and a quarter to inch and a half on any shower you build, and then going outward, just tack in a 1/4 inch per foot. Understand though, that 1/4 inch per foot is a plumbing code for water in a gravity fed area like a drain pipe. So what we're trying to do ultimately is build the slope so that when you put the final tile on, that your water sheds down into the drain nice and freely, which it really won't do too much on a 1/4 inch per foot. It'll get you good drainage, but you'll still have a little bit of residual water on the top of your tile. So I'm not adherent to that 1/4 inch per foot. I'm usually exaggerating a tad past that. The mortar, mixing up the mortar, I'll say a couple things about this. There's not really a recipe for mixing up the mortar. People advocate for dry pack, which is basically if you pack a bunch of that mortar into your hand like a snowball, that it shouldn't fall apart. Well, you could do that with almost anything. Oh, what I'm showing here, I showed a little piece of scrap 2x4 to set the parameter of my of where I'm going to stop. Yeah, I'm just kind of screeding out, you know, the perimeter at this point.
trying to get it to the point where, you know, I have a nice flat area and that's level on the perimeter. Just showing, I'm going to show that process. I call that a perimeter screed, and the perimeter screed is a way that a lot of guys do it. I don't do it that way. I just started to show it on there with that wood blocking, but that's on a later video that I'm going to show dedicated to a perimeter screed. This is the way I normally go about it. Oh crud, I didn't do good editing on that part. I'm mixing up mortar again. Good, more time to talk. So getting back to mixing the mortar, I don't do a dry pack. A little bit beyond that, it's a roughly one of these 60-pound bags, roughly about 2 sponges per bag. 2 to 2.5 sponges per bag is what I'm usually aiming for. Because if you do a dry pack as a homeowner, I get a lot of emails and stuff. Why is my dry pack the next day sandy and dusty, or 2 days or 4 days later sandy and dusty? I don't know. You didn't use enough water. So as a rule, I'm doing about 2 spongefuls per bag, and that gets me to the consistency that I want. There's my blocking again. Good, I can talk about that now. So the blocking would be about 1.5 inches or so around the perimeter, a little bit better than that. And then, you know, I kind of like, you know, make that perimeter screed go on, and then I can just pack my mortar in and slope it down to the drain in a pretty good fashion. But you know, I'm just showing that for the purposes of showing you on this. As I said, I'll get into that perimeter screed thing a little later. When I pack down my mortar, I generally am doing this whole process before I ever throw a level on it, because I can pretty much tell after years and years of doing these shower pans that my eye is pretty level. And now I'm using the level as kind of like to screed off some of the excess. And you could use any straight edge. I've got some crappy levels that I use generally as kind of a screed board. And it's, how would I put it? It's a touch and feel process that I go through with these. And then of course, yes, I throw levels on them eventually because I want it level across. I don't want level down to the drain. I want a slope, obviously, but I want it level across, and then I want it level on all 4 sides, and then with the eventual slope down to the drain. So it could take, by the time I mix the mortar, as a rule, it might take me 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes or so, you know, to finalize one of these pans. With everything that I'm doing there, you know, pushing off the excess, you know, like just it's a play thing, you know. You just play with it long enough to where you get it, you know, as perfect as you can possibly get it. Throw in a little extra pieces, you know, where there's voids and stuff like that. Throw your level on it continuously, and make sure that you know, I don't suggest that a homeowner try and do a dry pack. You know, mix it a little bit richer than that, not so dry. Best advice I could give on this. Also, the mortar that you saw is a Home Depot Quickcrete product with the green stripe, the yellow bag with the green stripe. I advocate for that for homeowners because the next day you can actually manipulate it. You can take a 9-inch blade and, you know, cut off some of the high spots, and, you know, you can play with it. The mortar mix that is a yellow bag with a red stripe, you cannot do that the next day. It's a richer mix, and you will not be able to do anything with that the next day. So as a rule, I'm advocating for, if you're going to shop at Home Depot, the Quickcrete yellow bag with the green stripe. I use the one with the red stripe, but if I shop at Lowe's, which I rarely do, I love Sakrete. Sakrete Sand Mix is what it's called. The aggregate is thicker. It's easier to work with. I like it a lot. I just don't shop at Lowe's enough to play with it. But that's the mortar that I would prefer if I had my choice. Every shower pan I would do with Sakrete rather than Quickcrete. But yeah, you can see how toward the end here, I'm just really honing up all of this material and getting it as perfect as possible, because I know tile has to go on top of it, especially if I'm doing a smaller, like a penny tile or something. It has to be as perfect as possible. Does it have to be pretty? No.
because it's going to be covered up, but I don't know. A lot of tile guys are always focused on making it as pretty as possible. And I just showed you going level all the way across, and there you go. That's basically how to do a shower pan. And you let it set with a fan blowing not on it but away from it, just to move the air around. I'm usually letting it set about at least 3 days before I encapsulate it with Red Guard. I just want all that moisture out of it first. And that is a complete process of doing a shower pan and mortar. And yeah, I'm going to show that perimeter screed at a later video, so look for that after all this series is done. It's a lot easier for some guys. For me, I use it once in a while, but as a rule, no. I hope you got something out of that video, and on to the next one. Today, after I have poured the mortar pan, and I'm just kind of going through doing the measuring of the wallboard. So while I'm screwing all this green board, so to be clear, green board is a gypsum product which is impregnated with a chemical in it that resists mold and mildew, and I have been using that for years and years. There have been times where I've used Durock, where I've used Hardy Backer, where I've used other type of backer boards. The one I like the best out of all of them is a product that's kind of hard to come by in Atlanta. Well, there are a couple. Triton is the last one that I worked with, and I love it. Triton is a backer board that's easy to score and snap. It's easy to shave off. It does all the things that I want a backer board to do as opposed to the cement boards. So it's a composite product. Triton is not easy to come by, and it's obviously pricier. There are other backer boards out there, the foam products that I worked with from time to time. A lot of times with the backer board specifically, it is what my customer wants rather than what I choose. I choose green board by default because at the end of the day, we're waterproofing no matter what backer board we're using, unless of course it's a foam board. There is a mantra about not using a gypsum product in a wet area. And I want to talk about that just for a second while you're watching all of this transpire. So having been in the apartment business for many years, back in the early to mid 90s, when tile start falling off of the wall is when we get a work order. And the tiles start falling off the wall because you have the shower valves, which are two-handle, hot and cold. They have packing, which goes bad, and the packing sprays behind the wall into the wallboard, and it ruins the sheetrock, which is typically what's up there. And then you have builder's grade 4x4 tile with unsanded grout. So that's the reason why walls fail with gypsum in a wet area, in a tub. They don't fail in showers. In fact, gypsum was used in showers for many, many years, from, say about late 70s, 80s into the 90s in showers. And I take those out on a frequent basis, and I've never run into any problems. In fact, I've never even been called on a shower that's failed because specifically they use gypsum. It's just never happened. Usually that only happens on a tub, and it only happens because of the seats and the washers and the packing that had to do with the old type of shower valves, which we're not using anymore either. So for that reason alone, I'm very comfortable using green board. That it has a mold and mildew inhibitor is why I choose that over normal sheetrock. So that's my take on that. Any other backer board, Triton, a lot of backer boards out there that would still need to be waterproofed. If you use Hardy Backer, yes, you're waterproofing. If you use Durock, yes, you're still waterproofing. If you use 8-inch cinder block and filled all those holes in with concrete, you're still waterproofing at the end of the day. And so that's why I feel like no matter what backer board, if I had 1/2-inch rigid cardboard, I'm very comfortable building a shower out of cardboard and then waterproofing it. And so that's kind of my take on the backer board that I'm using. I wanted to kind of go through that because a lot of people freak out when they see my videos and they see that I'm using green board, and they're like, oh, no, that's a no, you shouldn't be using gypsum product in a shower. And yes, if there was ever a failure of a shower, specifically because I use gypsum instead of a cement board, then I would be all on board with that. Going forward with waterproofing, it doesn't really matter. The board is up there to hold the tile, period. Anyway, moving on. You see, I just used my oscillating tool to cut that hole for my shower valve. Oscillating tool is awesome. It should be an awesome tool. They should just rename it the awesome tool. I do so much of my work with that oscillating tool, and by default I used to call it a Dremel, but in fact there are different brand names that have that. And undercutting of your door jamb, cutting holes in whatever backer board you're using. I mean, there's just it's so multifunctional that I can't even imagine working without it. Anyway, getting back to the backer board, I want to talk about this for a minute too. I'm using normal sheetrock 1.25" screws. And again, if you're using a backer board, specifically say Hardy Backer, they have their proprietary screws, which are coated that they don't rust. My take on it is, if you anticipate that your screws are going to get rusted behind your waterproofer, you've already failed the shower. So yes, I've taken out many a shower with rusted screws that were not waterproofed, and that's the caveat to how I kind of, there's a lot of common sense that goes into how I build a shower. There's also mitigation to failure, right? And so if there were failures with regard to what I'm doing here, I would mitigate those. In fact, raising my wallboard, as you see there, about 1 inch or so off of the shower pan floor is the way that I mitigate failures. Because as all tilers know, people who do bathrooms and shower renovations, almost all of our failures, I'm going to say 98% of the failures happen at the curb. Left and right of the curb, where those vertical studs that you see on the left and right get rotted out, and the curb itself sometimes get rotted out. By raising your backer board off of the floor by that 1 inch, all 4 sides around, you stop the issue of ever happening with wicking. So never have your backer board inside of the pan for sure, but also raise your wallboard. Because the only way that water is going to get through into your curb or into your studs, the vertical studs, is if there's some type of wicking action going on. That wicking transfers through your backer board into those studs, and then it takes years and years for those studs to get saturated to the point where they're just rotted out. And then it also transfers to your floor, the outside floor. And then you have a bigger issue with your subfloor being rotted out. That happens specifically because of the wicking action that goes on in showers. So yes, I make sure that I mitigate all the issues that I see when I tear showers out. I think it's extremely important to, when you take showers out, which all tile guys are, if you're building showers, and you see the failures, and you understand why it failed, and you mitigate those issues, then you're good to go. This is my particular way. There's probably, as many tilers as there are, there's that many ways to build a shower. And because we all know where points of failure are at, as I said, the number one place is the curb. The curb always gets the damage first. And as I said, those are adjoining vertical studs that match up to the curb. Second place, knee wall. Why? Because your knee wall is, let me talk about this for a minute. I'm cutting into that tape in the corners of the existing sheetrock so that they match up to my new sheetrock. And there's my Dremel at work again. I just love that thing. Oscillating tool, as it were. So I'm cutting out the backer for the niche that I've already measured out. You see the pencil marks there. So I'm usually building my niches about, I'm usually doing it on the back wall, the long wall. In this case, he wanted it on the rear wall, and so yeah. But I'm usually building them about 12 inches. But I'm putting my studs in there at a 17-inch mark to get my 12. because the stud, the top and the bottom stud that I'm putting in there horizontally at 17 inches, by the time I put backer board, tile, thin set, all that stuff, comes out to about 12 and some change, about 12 inches or so. And I'm usually doing, as I said, on the back wall about more or less about 28, 29 inches. It's 36 inches between the studs on the back wall, but again, by the time you build everything out, it's not 36 anymore. It's usually about 28, 29 finished product, so about 12 by 29, and this one's a little bit shorter than that, obviously. What was I saying before I so rudely interrupted myself? I don't remember now. Had something to do with waterproofing. Anyway, there's a product out there called Dent Shield. Dent Shield is a gypsum product that is waterproofed at the factory. And I love Dent Shield. On the few occasions that I've been able to work with it, it's very difficult to find, and it is kind of pricey. But it's pre-waterproofed, and it works in the same way as sheetrock because it's basically a gypsum product. So I am creating basically Dent Shield when I'm using gypsum, and then I waterproof it. Then I have created Dent Shield. This is, I think this is construction adhesive, but any caulking will do. And that's what I do. I just cut out the backboard that I need to go inside of the niche, and I just glue it in there. And obviously shaving off the edges that the Dremel doesn't quite fit on. Then I go forward with the top, bottom, and left and right pieces, and then I mud all that stuff to make it, kind of contiguous. Anyway, getting back to the Dent Shield. Dent Shield, again, is a gypsum product. The backer board I talked about earlier, Triton, acts a lot like gypsum, where you saw me take the razor knife and shave those pieces of sheetrock down. Triton works the same way. I can shave it down. And if you ever tried to shave a cement product, like especially with Hardy backer, you are not going to shave it successfully with a razor knife. You'll probably go through 15 blades trying to get one side shaved, and that's why I always prefer one of these type of products rather than a cement product. If I were to do, if on a tub, and I talked about it earlier, if on a tub I were using a backer board like this, I would not have it setting on the edge of the tub. I would have it setting on the lip. That way there's not water penetration that's going on. That's the only time that I found failures on wallboard, as I said earlier, on tubs, because people have a tendency of setting it on the edge of the tub, right down there where water can wick in through the caulking eventually and wick up the backer board. So you set it on the lip of the tub, you're good to go. And for that reason, I wouldn't use a cement product even on a tub shower combo. Going through this process, this is a long series. As you've already seen, there's already been a couple of videos that I've posted, and I'm going to put together all three of these 30-minute videos and make one very, very long video about how to build this shower. So this is a cement board. Yes, it's Durarock, and yes, I use Durarock on my horizontal surfaces. So if I have a bench, if I have a knee wall, or if I have a curb, which I always do, then I'm using a cement board. Well, why, Bob? Why aren't you using gypsum board on a horizontal surface? I just feel better about using it, a cement product, as it were, on these surfaces. And yes, even though it's going to get red guarded, and yes, even though I'm confident that no water will ever penetrate through, like I said, old habits are hard to break, and so I'm just more confident using cement product. So I use that on the curb, on the front, on the inside, and on the top. And when I'm finished with that, and you'll see momentarily, when I'm finished with that, I use some thin set, and I butter that curb just like I would a cake. like literally I just wrapped the whole thing. And so all of those punctures that you see, let me talk about that too. I think that's a very important point to hit on. The puncturing of the curb material, as it were, the pan liner, right? You saw where I screwed in all my backer board into that curb, and yes, I am puncturing into the pan liner that I wrapped it around. Seems counterintuitive to do that, right? If you're relying solely on the curb itself to be your waterproofer, but I'm not, right? So by buttering the entirety of the curb and, just making it like one monolithic piece, then I waterproof it, and therefore I don't have to worry about the curb ever seeing water. Plus, it can't wick up water because the inside of the curb is also raised that 1 inch I was talking about on the other 3 walls. So water cannot get without, right? It can't get within because I'm waterproofing it, and it can't get without, meaning into the adjoining studs or anything, because I'm waterproofing it. So I'm not really worried about that. Also, I wanted to mention there is and I'm using the term lightly, dam corners. Sometimes people call a curb a dam. So those are basically pieces of PVC liners that are kind of fashioned to wrap around the curb. Some guys use them on the inside of the curb, and they wrap around to the front, and then some guys use them on the outside as well. So they'll use 2 pieces of those dam corners on the left and the right. Here's my take on that. If you are not confident that your shower is waterproof from without, in other words, on the outside of everything, that you haven't waterproofed correctly, and you need dam corners, and water ever sees those dam corners, you failed the shower. You have failed the shower if those dam corners ever kick in. That's my take on it. Because, as you already saw, my curb is already wrapped, my walls are already wrapped. So those areas that we're concerned about, which is correct, it would be the left and right of the curb, that those dam corners are there to mitigate the issues that we run into when we see wood rot, means that water has penetrated through your curb for some reason, and therefore the dam corners would now kick in and kind of shed off any moisture or water that got into them. But you failed it already. Yeah, you failed it. It's almost like I'm a horrible driver, so I need an airbag just in case. And I don't know. Like I said, I have a different mindset. A lot of this is common sense, rather than reading by, books and manuals and stuff like that. Because on OJT, on-job training, when you take out showers and you find out how they fail, as I said before, you mitigate the issues, and that's what I do. People ask me sometimes, so if you use gypsum product on your walls, do you use thin set for all of this mudding, or do you use sheetrock mud? And my take on it is, if my customer wants a cement product, then I use thin set to do all of this. If I'm using grain board, which I am here, then I'm using sheetrock mud. And so then it's argued, well, why aren't you taping all those seams before you put the mud on? Tape is a crack preventer. If this was just 3 walls, right, and we weren't tiling it, it was just 3 normal walls, yes, I would be using tape, because the tape prevents the cracking from happening from movement of the 2 different planes, right? So the tape would be a mitigation effect for the cracking. RedGuard, Aqua Defense, Hydroban, 8+9, all of those liquid topical membranes are a crack preventer already. So if I were to use tape at all these seams, thinking that will prevent the cracking, but yet I'm using a crack preventer, it's a little bit of redundancy that doesn't really matter. I've had customers ask me, well, I know you don't use tape, but can you use tape for me? I'm like, sure, I'll use the tape if it makes you feel better. But that's all it is. It just makes you feel better. Once I have once I have put any waterproofer on top of all of this area, that prevents any cracking from ever happening. And if the cracking is so profound that it is transferring to your tile on a wall, yeah, you got bigger issues. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just putting on all of this sheetrock mud. And no, I don't use corner bead on a shower. It's kind of ridiculous to have that going on. The corner bead is a protector of the corners, and since I'm wrapping my corners with a tile anyway, and or I'm using a Schluter product on the end of it, then it's kind of doesn't make any sense. Plus, if you use corner bead, you have to feather out your mud, you know, probably 8, 9, 10 inches. So that bumps out your wall as opposed to the other flatness and all that stuff of the rest of the wall. So what I do typically, I'll put on one coat and I'll get it as good as possible. Like I'm doing here. I'm just getting off all this boogering. The next day I come in there and I sand off all the discrepancies, or if I have any type of feathering I have to do. You see, I think on the top there, you see that feathering I had to do to get it flat. Once I've sanded that off, I'll put on a second coat. Typically I'll put a fan on it, do other things, and then, you know, within a few hours I can sand that off and get it nice and smooth and flat. A lot of this that I'm doing is a little bit of overkill, meaning that because I'm red guarding and because, you know, tile and thin set and all that stuff is going to go on it anyway, does it have to be all smooth and pretty and perfect? No. But I have the time to kill as I'm doing all of this work, and because I have the time to kill and I know I'm going to be following it with tile, I want all of this prep as good as possible. What you saw earlier, or maybe you didn't see earlier in my previous video where I'm doing all the prep, I'm putting all the wood product, I'm building the curb, I'm doing, you know, the scabbing of the 2x6s in between the studs at the bottom. All of that stuff is in preparation for tile. All of this is in preparation for tile. Everything that I do as far as prep goes has an end result, which is, can I put tile on this and make it look good and make it fit? Everything in my mind is thinking about tile later on. So when some people purport that, you know what, I'll do all the prep, all I want you to do is tile, maybe, but more than likely no, because you don't know the parameters of what I can do with my tile and what I can't do. So more often than not, if somebody has said that to me and I've looked at their prep, no, I can't tile over it. All right, this is the buttering that I was talking about. The thin set that I'm using, in this case it's gray, and I believe because I think I'm using gray thin set for the entirety of the shower, if I'm not mistaken. So it doesn't really matter the color. If I'm using white thin set, then I'll butter my curb with the white thin set. Either which way, I'm still making, you know, this whole curb, as I said, kind of monolithic, you know, all the seams. Oh, and by the way, the inside and the outside wallboard go first, and then the top cap goes on there, and it kind of matters to me in that order. But I'm buttering the front, I'm buttering the back, or the inside as it were, and I'm buttering the top. And I'm making it nice and smooth as easy. So I'm filling in all of those screw holes, I'm filling in all the seams where the two backer board meet. So you're going to see me do something else here too with this mud. Thin set, as it were. I'm jumping the gun a little bit. So what you're going to see me do here momentarily, I'm trying to get my shower as waterproof as possible so that no water ever penetrates my pan material. For that reason alone, I feel like through the years I've noticed that Red Guard sticks to different material a different way. And it sticks to thin set a whole lot better than it does my mortar bed. And where the mortar meets up the pan liner, all four sides around, seems to me the Achilles heel. So for that reason, I screed out some of my thin set right up against, and you'll see that momentarily, right up against where the pan liner meets the mortar material. I screed some thin set all 4 sides around, so that when I finally red guard, I know I have good adhesion of that red guard going up against that area. If I have any dips in my shower pan, I screed a little thin set on that. I screed thin set. Oh, ooh, this is very important. What do I do with my bump outs, Bob? You know, where all my corners are at. I have this bump out material after I've set my shower pan. You know, they're bump out of the folds in the corner. And so the way that I take care of that is I take off little pieces of Durarock that I'd wrap my curb with. And you see that I'm pushing it into that void, because that void is caused, you know, your mortar is not pushing up against that those folds of the corner. But when it dries, yes, you're going to have a loose corner because of the folds of the pan liner. So I'm pushing in Durarock into those voids that are caused, you know, that you can't help. And that's a very that's a dull chisel, trust me on that. I'm not cutting any pan liner at that point, but I'm pushing those pieces of Durarock into those voids, and then here I go with the thin set at the perimeter, including where I just pushed in the Durarock in the voids. Funny thing is, sometimes I don't have any Durarock on hand, and I have gone outside and I have found pieces of pebble that will fit into those voids perfectly. Or if they don't fit in perfectly, I'll just, you know, take my hammer and bang a piece of rock up into pieces, and I'll stick the pieces of rock in there. Anything to fill that void that then I can go over with thin set and get as close a corner as possible. The other place, before I interrupted myself, the other place that I screed the thin set is around the drain. Because again, for the same reason, I just feel like the red guard, yes, will stick to the mortar pan, but it sticks a whole lot better with the thin set involved. And so I get my thin set as close to the neck of that drain as I possibly can, and you'll see that momentarily. And once again, it doesn't really matter, you know, the white thin set works just as well. In fact, I like working with the white thin set. I don't know, it seems hardier, if that's the correct term. And there's where I'm going right up to the edge of the drain, and I'm leaving myself, you know, like no gap whatsoever on the inside portion of that drain with my blade there, and pushing the thin set in as far as I can. And then later on in the next video, you're going to see where I put a bead of silicone right up against there as well, and then my red guard will overlap onto that silicone so that we don't have any leaks. Alright, so the next day after I have put out all the mud on the wallboard, you see me sanding everything off. That is the first sand, the final sand after I start filling in all the voids. You see on the left hand side there are some voids, and you know, I just go through and get everything as perfect as possible after the sanding process. If you were using a backer board, a proper backer board, meaning Durarock or any other cement type of backer board, then you would be using thin set, and then you have to be a little more stringent on putting the thin set on, because you're not going to be able to sand thin set. But yeah, there's a straight edge going up there because I need, and I'm marking with a pencil where my voids are at, because that's where I'm going to be doing the feathering of the sheetrock mud. I'm trying to get my wall as plumb and level as possible, which it kind of facilitates putting the tile on, so that you're not ending up, you know, proportionately more thin set in one area than you are the other. And that's the whole point of doing all this prep. The prep actually takes longer than the actual tiling, because we're trying to get things as perfect as possible. You know, even this bottom area right here, you can see I'm not doing a lot of feathering, but I'm doing enough to get it, you know, to the point where I'm not really having to worry about, you know, any of the, as I said, the excess thin set being glopped on there, because that's not what I want. Are there easier ways to make this happen? Yeah, possibly. You know, backer board doesn't make it easier necessarily. Backer board, proper backer board, if it was Hardy backer, Durarock, or any of that stuff, it doesn't make the process easier, because the whole process starts when you're at the wood level, right? Before all the backer board goes up, no matter what you're using, you're trying to get your walls as plumb and true, and yeah, you're trying to get that to happen first before the backer board goes up. But if you can't do that, or if you don't do that, then you have to mitigate all of that with your backer board, and yeah, that's a process. So after this dries, which the second day on this doesn't take long for it to dry. I actually put a fan on it, and I'll go off and do something else. In this case, I'm only doing the shower, not the bathroom, so I'm kind of relegated to not doing anything else. If I gotta make a trip to Home Depot, or if I gotta do some emails out in the truck or something like that, I'll do that for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then sand that off, which I've already done, and there was no point in showing all that. But all those areas that I feathered out, I came back and sanded later, and everything is as flat and smooth as I can possibly get it. Then I go on to the red guard portion, and again, I shop at Home Depot, so red guard is my default product, but it wouldn't matter if it was Hydroban, Aqua Defense, 8+9. There's probably 8 or 9 different liquid topical membranes out there that you could use. So I don't have a preference one to the other. It's just that I shop at Home Depot. And so yeah, a brush and a roller is my default tools to apply this, and you can see I put tape down there, blue tape down at the floor, so I don't over slop on that, and then I pull it off. By the time my second coat, so you see the corners, and I gotta address this because I have a certain way, everybody has their own way, but I do the corners. You saw the inside of the niche has already been done with a brush. The corners got done with a brush, and then the curb got done with a brush, and then I use a roller. And people ask me what kind of roller, and I'm like, I don't know. I just pick up the cheap one, the one that is not as nappy, because I don't want a bunch of that red guard getting soaked up into the roller and just waste it. So yeah, the less nappy one, the better. I go up to just past the shower head, because I don't see the purpose in going up past the shower head. No moisture or water content's ever going to get into that area, so I'm not concerned about that. But usually I just kind of, especially on the outside part of the shower, where the water is never going to get sprayed on, I don't worry about that too much. But I go up as high as possible, and then I just kind of work it around. I don't know if I show the second coat on this video, but I do, generally speaking, I do 2 coats on the wall, and usually 3 coats in the corners and the curb. Those are the areas, and the niche. Those are the areas where I can see that it would have a more moisture content than the other places. You also see that I used a brush going around the shower valve as well as the shower head, and then it gets overlapped with the roller eventually, because I want it to go up to the edges of that wallboard as much as possible, which is why I use a brush. And really, that's as easy as it gets. I mean, it's like basically you're painting. There are some people who read directions on product, and apparently the directions, I haven't read them even today, on red guard says that that you should apply it with some type of sheetrock knife or something like that, and it has a certain mill thickness that you have to adhere to, and blah 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 blah. From the day I started using this stuff, probably 8 years ago, I still haven't read the directions, but this has kind of taught me just OJT, on the job training, on how to apply it properly. And since I have a couple of videos on my channel going back 5+ years, One of them is painting a cardboard box with red guard, 2 coats, and letting that water sit in that cardboard box for over a week with no damage and no penetration of the red guard. Only 2 coats. Then about 3 years ago, I did a sheetrock box. I think it was like a 18-inch by 18-inch sheetrock box that I just used caulking in the corners to hold it together, and I painted that with 2 coats of red guard. Let that set. I believe it was 19 days. I think it was 19 days. I let that set with water in it, and it was a good amount too. I think it was probably 5 gallons or better, and there was still no penetration into the sheetrock or anything. So I'm very, very confident with this product. Yeah. Although recently I've used Ardex, and I like Ardex. One of the reasons that I don't use Aqua Defense more is because it dries a dark green, and as I'm doing my tiling, I like to have pencil marks on the wall, and I can't see those marks with Aqua Defense. But Ardex dries like a battleship gray, so it makes it much easier to see the pencil marks. And Ardex still has a bit of a fume to it, as Red Guard definitely does, but not quite as much. So yeah, I like Ardex. It's not easily got, and that's why I don't use it more commonly. Also, around that drain, you see there's some white silicone. So I always screed with my finger some white silicone right up under the edge of that drain, and press it down into the shower pan, and then I overlap my Red Guard onto that silicone, because if water is going to get anywhere as Achilles heel, it's going to be around that drain area and the perimeter. And that's why I use my brush into that gap that I leave with my wallboard. I use my, I think it's a 5-inch brush I'm using, and I push it into that gap really well so that it hits right where the mortar hits the pan liner around the perimeter. And then of course, like I said, with the, oh wow, I really messed up on that. No, I didn't. No, I'm showing, so yeah, the second coat is done. This is a dry fit. God, I thought I was showing the final. Whew. So I always recommend doing a dry fit with your floor tile, the mosaics, and I call every sheet tile a mosaic, because they're going to require some trimming. And this is what I'm doing there. I'm realizing that my pan liner bumps out a little bit, so I'm kind of trimming off the edges to kind of accommodate for that bump out, and doing the dry fit. And the dry fit for me, well, for anybody for that matter, but for me is very, very important, because by the time I start tiling, I don't want to sit there and try and, oh, I got to shave part of this part off, or I got to do this, or I got to do that. No, I'm doing all that prior to setting the tile, prior to even putting the thin set, mixing it up. So obviously I needed to cut this one sheet, and again, I'm doing all that cutting and all that stuff because I'm figuring out on my, I think this is, yeah, obviously this is my niche tile, and so I know that I have a cut to accommodate left and right of that centerpiece on the niche, so I'm doing that ahead of time, and then I can set that over off to the side in kind of a vertical fashion and let all the excess water come off of that. In fact, yeah, you see that I did that inside of all the wrap of it, and there we go, 2 perfect fit. So I let that, put it over off to the side, those pieces, let them dry out so I'm not contending with the excess water, and worry about that later. This is the faux marble curb top. It's a quartz type of material that my customer picked out, because you do have choices with this type of tile. You can do a marble, or you can do this quartz, and the quartz is a brighter type of white, and I knew that my niche was skinnier than normal, so I'm just ripping this piece because he wanted the window frame type design, as you see there at the bottom. I thought I was going to show that cut, but I guess I didn't. So that bottom piece kind of jets out like a window, the bottom of a window, and I like that actually. I I like it because because my field tile can go up to it. I don't have to do any type of, special cuts with my field tile or anything when I get to that bottom part. So that bottom part gets set in, then the top, and then the sides. I thought I was going to show that cut, but you can just see where it was kind of notched out. And there is no specific size for that notch. I just kind of hoof it. I think that's probably 1.5 inch notch, both left and right. And then I put some thin set on it. This is where I do my, you saw some of the thin set on the back end was a little heavier than the front end. And that's where I get my little slope going on so water sheds off of it. Yeah, any type of horizontal surface you want water to shed off, that would be the curb, the niche, and a bench. And my crappy levels I had to use because my Stabila, my 24-inch Stabila wouldn't fit in there. But I double check my crappy levels because they're crappy. A lot of people will say to do the back end of the niche, your mosaic, if you will, in this case a 2x2. Should you do that first, or should you do the sides of the niche? It doesn't matter. Most niches don't get the tsunami that people think they do. So to me, it's not really that important. In this case, I'm doing all of my back of my 2x2 first, and then I'm doing the sides. But a lot of people feel like the inside part, left, right, top, should be done first, and then the inset part last. It makes it for a little bit more difficult of a cut to get it in there perfect, whereas doing the back first and then doing the sides, you don't have to worry about getting the mosaic cut perfect because of the overlap, the way it's going to go in. I am not troweling this out to get, normally on field tile, we're trying to trowel it out so we can collapse the ridges, and that's not the purpose for my trowel here. The purpose for my trowel is to make sure that the thin set is the same going across, and that it's thin, that I don't have like glopped up thin set. So say a 6-inch knife, taping knife or whatever, would not do that for you. So yes, I apply it with that, but then I go ahead and use my trowel. I think it's a little 1/4-inch trowel that I used on there. And I do it at a nice sharp 45-degree angle at least. And then I use a float to push all those down so that there's no lippage or anything going on. And get off all the excess thin set. I have a little tiny screwdriver I do that with. You don't want that thin set to dry. The next day it's going to be a lot more difficult to get out of those cracks. Yeah, speaking of my 6-inch taping knife, that is my best buddy. I don't use my trowel, my normal trowel. I know a lot of people use the back of the trowel, the flat end of the trowel, to kind of screed out their thin set. Yeah, I don't do that. I use my 6-inch knife right there. I think I use the same 1/4-inch trowel. In fact, I know I do, on the floor. Again, you're screeding and getting those ridges on there, not for the purpose of collapsing the ridges necessarily, although that's an end result benefit. But you're doing that to get a contiguous screed of your thin set, so that you don't end up glopped up thin set on one end, and then, yeah. That's the reason that I'm using that, the little 1/4-inch trowel. And that cut piece to the right, you saw the first one go in. That was already dried out after I had run it through the wet saw to knock off the corner area. That I set that on end and let it dry out as I'm doing something else. And then it's nice and dry when I go to put it in. And all these pieces are numbered, or they're stacked in such a way that I had already dry fitted them, so that I know when I go in to actually set them that they're in the correct order. think this piece will actually fit right up under that gap of the wallboard that I left at the curb. Slide right in there. And that's why I like raising my wallboard, besides the wicking action, and that's the whole purpose of raising your wallboard, so there's no contact between your wallboard and your shower pan. But the advantage is then it makes the rest of your floor tile disappear into those gaps, and then your wall tile will overlap onto that. And that should always be the way things are done, although, you know, every tile guy does things different. It's just that makes more sense to me. And you can see clearly there on that drain area where I had brushed my red guard and overlapped onto that white silicone that I had already applied on there. So my areas where water penetration could ever happen are already negated, and never have to worry about what. In fact, I could do a flood test the way it sets now before this tile is on there, and it would pass the flood test without a problem. So that we're not really doing the water in, water out system. So then 3-piece drain with the weep holes and, you know, the pre-slope and all that stuff is not an issue anymore the way that I do these. There is a process out there called the divot method, which is in a long roundabout way the way I'm doing this. It's a little more complicated, it's a little more time consuming, and I don't see that there's an advantage to doing a divot system shower pan over the way that I'm doing them. I think the only advantage, they should call it a funnel system, not a divot system. But because it acts like a funnel, any excess water would kind of drain into that funnel area. But I think it would set there below the tile into the thin set, as opposed to the way I'm doing it, where it's all kind of contiguous. Where if water gets, well, when water gets into the grout line, that, you know, all it has is the thin set before the red guard, and eventually evaporate the same way that it went in. So same thing, I'm using a float on any mosaic that I use. I would use a float to push down all the tiles so that they're all pushed down into the thin set, and that there's no one tile that's going to be higher or lower than the other. You could use anything, the float is the easiest. And yeah, wipe everything off as you go. Much easier to maintain than trying to clean up everything the next day. This, when I'm cutting out around the drain area, individual tile, as I'm doing here, I don't get to that toward the end of the video, but this is something that I started doing, I think, from day one. If you go back to my videos 11 years ago, I think I'm still doing the same thing back then that I'm doing now. As a rule, I'm always having my my floor tile setting slightly above the drain cap. And I know a lot of people are focused on having their tile and their drain cap flush with each other. I have seen in, you know, walking this planet so long, I have seen tile lower than the drain cap because of whatever, I don't know, subfloor moves, you know, the shower pan material moves downward, whatever, but then you have pooling around the drain area. So I just felt like it was common sense to have that tile sitting above the drain cap, so that if there's any settling, if there's anything going on, unbeknownst to me years later, and there's some type of pressure pushing down on that pan, that there'll never be an issue of water pooling. I think it gives a better ability for, I think it's easier for water to shed off into the drain with that positive flow going down. And you'll see a little bit later where I'm going to take those individual tile that I've kind of preset there, and I literally cut those in circular fashion. To each one individually gets cut in a circular fashion depending on how it's wrapping around the drain, and then I do a little taper cut on the edge, and the taper cut ensures, as I said, positive water flow going into the drain. See how that slides into the bottom of that gap? I just love that. I just think it's so much of a better way than having it, you know, flush up against the wall. Yeah, making sure that my slope is on point. Yeah, always double and triple and quadruple check everything as you go along. You know, the floor is probably arguably the most important part of a shower because it's always a floor that fails. It's your ankle below. I'm going to say it like that. Well, your calf. Okay. So about mid calf below is always going to be your failure point of a shower. Always. It's going to be at the curb. It's going to be at the left and the right of the curb. It's going to be, you know, at the wall, at that, you know, that first tile going down. And so, you know, this area is the most important to get right, not only with regard to waterproofing, but all of your tile and all that stuff. You can imagine all the garbage, you know, from shampoo to soap to, you know, oils of your skin to hair dyes to all of that stuff, is going to be squarely on your shower pan material all the time, every day. And that's kind of why I take this area so seriously and take time. It's also a show place, you know, like people are going to look down and see how nicely the tile is done, or conversely how crappy it's done. So I always take time on this, more so than the walls. The walls are kind of boring, but the niche and the floor are kind of the artistic things that we do insofar as building a shower. It's probably a good idea to have a couple of, you know, t-shirts or sponges, dry sponges and stuff like that to sponge off the excess water off of these mosaics. I don't always have that, which is why you just saw me wipe it on my pants, because you don't want to put a totally wet tile onto that thin set. Yeah, we're getting ready to wrap this up. I kind of already went through the explanation of those individual tiles around the drain, so I'm not going to talk too much more about that. I will talk about that toilet off to the left with the pee in it. I should have flushed that or closed the lid. Sorry about that, folks. But yeah, make sure that your floor, if this is a DIY project, if you're a homeowner and you're gonna tackle this, you don't have to follow the way that I've done it on my video necessarily, but just, you know, keep the basics in mind. You want a completely waterproof pan area, so that there's no possibility of water penetration into your pan area, which would beget potentially a failure in the future. That left and the right of the curb, I think previously I talked about the dam corners. That left and right of the curb are the reason dam corners started being sold. You can make your own out of the PVC liner, but at the end of the day, you see how the curb and the walls are kind of flow contiguous, and the curb and the walls are 100% waterproof, which is why I don't use the dam corners. The dam corners came out because of all the failures that we have left and right of the curb, and you know, that was some type of way to mitigate those failures. But to me, as I said before in a previous video, if water sees your dam corners, you've already failed your shower. So the way that I do it, I 100% make sure that water never gets into those left and right side by having the surface waterproof. So that is your first line of defense. The tile is arguably your first line of defense because obviously a lot of tile out there, especially the larger porcelain, is definitely waterproof. So yeah, you could say that tile is your first line of defense, especially with that contiguous curb top that I put on. In this case, it'll be a quartz. Same material I put in the niche will be the curb top on this shower. And so that is my first line of defense. My second line of defense is a red guard. And then nothing will get through that. But if it should, for whatever reason, then you have your pan liner as a backup. Oh, and by the way, because I get the question a lot, What about your grout? No, your grout is not your waterproofer. Caulking arguably would be waterproofer in the corners, change of planes and stuff like that, but especially on a vertical surface, I don't really see that as an issue. By the way, I don't do any caulking in my showers when I leave. I think you're buying a problem that generates a solution into the future, meaning that every year, or 2 years, or 3 years, you're going to have to cut out all that caulking you put in, which is a real pain, and then recaulk. And especially with some of these texture tile, it becomes a real hassle to take all that out. So I'm not into the caulking thing unless there's a reason for it. If you have cracking in the future of grout line, then yeah, put some caulking in there, but otherwise I don't do that. Here is where I'm fashioning out the individual tile, taking out the little excess thin set as I push those individual into the thin set, doing a little cleanup as I go. But yeah, just takes time. Make that little circular cut, like I did there, put a little taper on it, back butter. Even the small tile, do a little back butter. You want that thin set on your floor, there I go, back butter the tile. Even the little tiny ones, make sure that they're set in there very, very well. Push them down very well. You don't want a failure of any of this tile ever. And then, a little screwdriver doing the clean out between the grout lines. Much, much better to do it when the thin set is wet than the next day. But yeah, that's basically it. I think we're winding down on this portion, and then we'll get on to the next portion, which will be the wall tile. Look how long it takes me. Make a little pencil mark in a circular fashion around there. Yeah, it kind of drives me crazy sometimes, especially with some of the the basket weave thatch type of marble tile with the little black dots in them. Oh my god, those are so hard to get around a drain. But the payoff is worth it. I think it's a nice clean look afterward. And again, that positive water flow that I'm going to get, or the customer gets, going forward. Yeah, so we're going to move on to the wall tile in the next portion. Alright, so now we get to the tiling portion, and before I do that, I always like to use this golf ball demonstration to show that we have good pitch for the tile and the water going into the drain. I like doing that. I've already grouted the shower floor, and I usually let it dry, I don't know, a couple hours at least beforehand, before I start tiling the walls. Here I'm just kind of sorting out where the tile is going to land. So as you saw earlier, I made markings on where my tile is going to land going up to the ceiling, because I don't want a sliver cut at the ceiling. And now I'm just marking the middle portion and figuring out what my cuts are going to be on the left and right. I was a little fortunate with this job that my customer did not want this tile staggered, which is almost always the case. But regardless, the measurements are still done ahead of time so that you know where things are going to land properly. And then I use what I call a ledger board, and this is usually a straight 1x. There are different types of 1x at Home Depot. I get the most expensive one because they tend to be straighter. So it's a finished piece rather than kind of a rough piece. Anything could be a ledger board. I carry quite a few of these 1x's in my arsenal of weapons, because all showers are kind of created differently with size and all that stuff. And so once I've leveled out, I go up. If this tile is 11 3/4, for example, I go to about 11 and a half, maybe a little better than a half. And I go to my highest point of my shower, which none really should be the highest, but I always double check and measure that. And that's where my ledger board goes. Sometimes just shy of what the tile size is, because I know that eventually that first row will go last, and it's going to have to be shaved down. With any luck, a lot of times I don't have to shave that first piece that I set in last. I don't have to shave it at all. That it fits perfectly, and that's what my goal is.
But I do my ledgers all the way around. I use a laser level as well as a level to make sure that I'm right on point. That makes it possible for me to run my tile from day one of doing the field tile. I can run my tile all the way up to the ceiling if I want to. And then the next day I can pull those boards off and then put in my first tile last. And you'll see that a little bit later on. I flip that bottom tile upside down and make the mark of any cuts that I have to do. Yes, cross weight every which way I can, get it level. So you saw where I was setting that level on 2 different boards to make sure that that's good to go. And then of course a piece of sheetrock, a piece of cardboard, something to protect the floor as I'm stacking my tile. I don't want the thin set to glob all over it. And by the way, with those ledger boards being screwed in the wall that's already waterproofed, what I do is when I pull those boards off, I don't know if I show it in here, but where those screw holes are at, I fill that in with some silicone. This is where the tiling process begins in earnest. I always start with my largest back wall first, and I'll run that all the way up to the ceiling if I want to, but usually at least 3 or 4 rows of tile get on that back wall first before I ever address the left and the right. I use a 6-inch taping knife to throw my mortar up on there, and as you saw earlier, kind of key it into the backer. You could use the opposite end of your trowel, but this 6-inch taping knife I use a lot. And it depends on the habit that you get into. I suppose at first, if I had gotten into the habit of using the flat side of my trowel to do all of that, then I would have started that process, and that's how I would have worked it. And a lot of guys do, but I don't. So a 6-inch taping knife is by default what I use, but it doesn't really matter as long as you get the job done. My troweling is with a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch notch trowel. On large format tile, that's what you want. And you see there I'm putting my laser on it, making sure that even though my ledger board is level as possible, I still want to throw my laser up there to ensure that as I'm stacking, not necessarily every single row, although you could do that, but at least every couple of rows I throw my laser up there, make sure I'm on point. And then of course every row I'm putting a level on regardless. The troweling of the thin set directionally, these are 12 by 24 tile, and you have an elongated left to right on a larger tile. So when I do my troweling, I don't do it left to right, same as the tile runs, because with those ridges you're ultimately trying to collapse them. As you saw, I back butter my tile always, doesn't matter what sides. And so my trowel marks want to be in opposition of the long part, which is why I'm now troweling it out in opposition, because it's a lot easier for air to get compressed out of there as you push the tile into the thin set and collapse those ridges in a shorter distance, which would be the way I'm doing it now, as opposed to, you know, the long way left to right. Leveling clips became a solution to a problem. When we started getting into large format tile, probably about a good 7 or 8 years ago, the large format tile are burned in such a way that they're heated and yada yada yada. There's a lot of explanation I can go into as to why a lot of this tile is bowed, and because it's bowed, you have to use leveling clips. They, as I said, became a solution to a problem that began with large format tile. And as I said before, I got really fortunate with this job where he did not want it staggered. So the leveling clips are a little less needed. I still use them regardless, but when you're stacking tile rather than offsetting it, the bow effect doesn't happen quite as much. This is a relatively good tile.
It is what we call rectified, meaning that every single tile. Oh, I want to talk about this. I don't use a manual cutter very often. I should, but I don't, because I have to have relative consistent lines, which I have. I know going up this left and right side that I'm going to have basically the same cuts all the time. And it makes it easier using a manual cutter than it does, running that through my wet saw over and over and over. So yes, I use my manual cutter, especially in this bathroom. It's a very, very small work area, and the manual cutter just, for me, worked better on this particular job. Getting back to the difference between rectified and non-rectified, every tile in every box, if you take one out arbitrarily from one box to another one, all those tiles should match up side by side, end to end, perfectly, with maybe a 32nd inch difference at best, right? You don't want to see like a 16th inch discrepancy of two tile against each other. Also, the edge are cornered edges, meaning they're straight, as opposed to some tile which has a slight curvature on the edges, which at that point is not rectified. And the reason that matters to us, if you have, say, a 16th inch discrepancy between two tile, and that becomes consistent, then by the second row that 16th becomes an 8th, and then the 8th becomes, it just exponentially becomes a larger line, which is why all tilers would rather work with a rectified than non-rectified tile. And you will pay a little bit more. And some tile out there that comes from China and other places say on the box that it's rectified, and when it's truly not. And the only way to kind of decipher that, oh yeah. So what I do is I'm running my tape all the way up to the ceiling. The ceiling is, although ceilings are off also, but the ceiling is a pretty good indicator of, as I measure down from the ceiling to that second row of tile, I want to see the same measurement on both left and right. So if I'm measuring 67.5 on the left, I want to be 67.5 on the right. And that matters, because even if I end up with a sliver cut at the top, which we try and avoid, then at least I want that sliver cut to be consistent. So I can manipulate my tile somewhat as the rows start stacking up to take up for that difference if I have to. And it's pure manipulation. All that, that's all the tile part is. All the prep that you saw earlier, all that prep takes the longest. It'll take me, out of a 10-day job, usually 7, sometimes 8 days as prep before I ever start setting tile. So during that process, everything matters, because I know I'm going to be tiling over my prep, so I'm trying to get it right. But yeah, the rectified is 1,000% better, if it's a true rectified, than any other tile. What you saw earlier, as you're looking at the video on the left side, I had put in a little piece, I don't know if you saw it or not, I had put in a little piece of scrap Schluter. I have an edging with the Schluter, the aluminum trim. See it there? So I'm sizing that up as I'm setting my tile, because I know that my trim is going to go last, and I want it to be consistent going up the wall. There are a lot of guys that will set their edging in there first, and somehow glue it in there with some thin set, and then run their tile up to it. And I don't know. For me, everybody has their own method. It's always been easier for me to set my Schluter last. That way, even if the wall is off, and this one definitely was, that my Schluter, that my tile and my Schluter will run consistent with the off wall, right? That's kind of the way I look at it anyway. And I'm going to get to that process when we get toward the end of the tiling. What I'm doing is I'm leaving a gap. It's hard to see on this video because it's fast speed, but there's a small gap probably 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch on the edge of that wall that I'm not putting thinset on. And I think you're going to see it here. I think on this tile I actually put thinset on the edge, and then I scrape it up. There I go. I'm scraping it off because I know full well that's the gap that I want to leave for my schluter later on. And when I say 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, it really doesn't matter, because 98% of my tile is affixed to the wall, and that little 1 or 2% at the edge will get filled in. I'll push some thinset into that gap and then slide my schluter strip in there retroactively, meaning after all the tile is done. But I'm still checking it with that little scrap piece of schluter that I have, and I'm making sure, that's, you saw my rubber mallet, I'm making sure that my tile are up to the edge as possible, which on this particular job was really, really hard. This condo was built, I believe, in the 80s, and it was, I think, an apartment complex at one time, and it was just a shoddy workmanship with the whole building and every unit, and nothing was square and plumb and flat and level here at all. And then, of course, you saw earlier, if you watched the prep part, that I had to screed out some extra mud on that wall to get it, you know, to the point where I was happy with a straight edge going on. So the battle that we run into prior to the tile, trust me on that, is real. You know, we're always, you know, there's not a lot of playroom with tile. It's kind of finite to some extent. I mean, you can shave and manipulate and cut, you know, and do what you can, but at the end of the day, you want the tile to be as nice and level and flat and all that stuff as possible. And when you're not dealing in a perfect world, it's hard to get your perfect thing going on. This is a rubbing stone, so after I cut the tile on the edge of there, it's literally a stone that is, best way I could put it is like sandpaper, a sandpaper-ish type of stone. The rubbing stone knocks off that rough edge of the cut, if you have a rough edge, so that when I set that cut edge on that left corner there, that you're not seeing, you know, like, you're not seeing a bad cut. You're seeing more or less a factory edge on that left side. And by the way, my factory edges are always factory to factory. All my cut edges are always in the corner. Always, always. Here we get to, yeah, the grinder. So you can run this through a tile saw and make those cuts, and it'll take a while, and you'll see that I go through my wet saw and kind of knock off, you know, the other part. But this grinding wheel, which is basically, you know, a diamond type blade, same as your wet saw, this is how I'm making my cut around the valve. And of course I'm doing it outside because it does kick up a lot of dust, so you're kind of doing that at an angle, and then you can just knock off the larger pieces with something, and to kind of, yeah. So I don't use a grinder a whole lot. I thought I'd show it in this video to make life easier for some of you guys, but I can run that through the wet saw and do little straight cuts and knock those straight cuts off, and then kind of follow up with it like I'm doing here, almost as easy and as fast as I could a grinder. But the grinder is a very, very helpful tool when doing circular cuts. I don't know why we are so perfectionist. Look at that little 1/8 of an inch that I'm knocking off of there to fit around that mud cap, even though I know full well that my escutcheon plate that goes on there will definitely cover that edge. We're just so focused on getting nice, clean, tight cuts all the time, and it's annoying. It's annoying for us that we have to do things that we feel compelled to make things as perfect as possible. You know, because it does speak. I mean, all the prep you don't see, but the tiling part you do see, and well, arguably you're not going to see that cut. Again, it's going to be covered, but yeah, that's what we're focused on. Yeah, so you move that tile around, collapse those ridges the best you can. I'm still leaving a gap on that left side because the schluter will go inside of there as well. And then you can knock down the edges as you're putting the clips inside of there. And that's what I'm doing there. And anything will work. You know, the tool that I'm using there, it doesn't have to be that. It could be, you know, your 6-inch knife. It could be, you know, a smaller knife. It doesn't really matter. But people are fixated on certain tools for certain things, and that's not necessary. Yeah, that's where I'm cutting for the shower valve. And that diamond tip hole cutter with that guide, put a little water in there, you know, do a little, you see how I'm kind of turning it around a little bit. I'm not going straight into it so it doesn't get caught up. And that's how I do my holes if I have holes to cut, which on this case is going to be the neck of that shower head. There are different ways to cut holes. It doesn't even have to be circular. It could be a square. But again, you know, we're fixated on details that will never be seen because I know the plate is going to cover that. Where am I going here? I don't know why I went outside. Yeah, here's where I'm actually doing the bottom row. I've pulled off the boards and now I'm making my mark. You saw my tile was backwards at first. You know, I kind of flipped the tile upside down and then made my mark at the top, which now becomes the bottom. And then I'm shaving off, it looks like about 1/2 inch. And then that cut side will go squarely at the bottom. Even though I marked it at the top, I know it's kind of back-assward, but I marked it at the top and then flipped it back over and marked the lines on the surface. And then when I cut it, it fits in there like a glove. Of course, I have about 1/8 of an inch gap that I leave for the spacing between the tile, and about another 1/8 inch gap before the floor, which is why eventually I'm going to put in some shims in there to kind of bump it up. And I will cut all of those as I'm doing, dry fit them first, so I have enough time for them to dry before I put mud on there and set them on the wall. And before I do that, I get over to the curb area. I think I've already set the outside and the inside of the tile of the curb. Yeah, I think I have already. But I'm doing that before I do my wall tile because I want the overlap of my wall tile definitely on the top of that curb. That's one contiguous piece of quartz. And I could have just as easily used one of these 6-foot long marble. My customer had chosen quartz, and it was cut down the size perfectly, wall to wall, left to right. And then I'm just trying to get my slope right. So I just throw a bunch of mud on top of that. I think I'm going to show that. Throw a bunch of mud on there. And the outside of my tile is slightly raised so that I can get my slope properly. The inside is flush with the top of the curb. And I think the outside is sloped. I think those shims on the outside of that tile are pushing up that outside tile probably about 1/4 of an inch. About 1/4 of an inch. And then the discrepancy between that 1/4 of an inch and my flush part of my inside now gets filled in with mud that I screed off evenly going across. And back butter my piece of quartz. And the back buttering on here is so that, you know, the top of my curb and the quartz have a good adhesion to each other. So the back buttering here is not as, it doesn't have to be thick. You know, like I put it on thick to begin with because it's a long, you know, 5-foot run. But then I screed off all the excess. Again, you're just trying to get good adhesion between the two material. And that's what the mud does for you. And there it goes. Set it right on top. wiggle it around a little bit so that the two blend together. And yeah, now my wall tile can overlap that. You see, water will shed off of my wall tile onto the curb that's, you know, like literally fashioned into the wall already. Also, these curb tops are usually 6 inches wide, and by the time you're done with your prep, you have 5.5. So in the past, my customers are okay with that little 1/2 inch overhang between the 6 inches of the curb and the 5.5 of, you know, a finished. When I say finished, the inside and outside tile is done on the curb, and they're okay with that 1/2 inch overhang. But lately, people are not wanting that. They're wanting that curb top flush. So for that reason, you have to put two pieces of backer board either on the inside or the outside of the curb in order to bump that out to where your final is 6 inches, so your curb top will work right. This is where I said earlier how I'm pushing in thin set into that gap that I intentionally put on the edge of the tile. And so I think I have a little 3-inch taping knife that I'm doing that with. Because I'm getting ready to slide my Schluter strip into that gap. And you see that gap at the top of the ceiling. As I said, you know, some of that tile at the very top is pretty flush, and then some of it toward the end on that wall I'm working on isn't. There's probably about a 3/4 inch gap, which I wasn't happy about on this job, but you know, it is what it is. So I asked my customer what he wanted to do about it, and he said, "Oh, I can just leave it like that. I'm not picky." And I'm like, "Well, I am. You know, I don't want, you know, like a 1/4 inch gap at the front of the shower, and then you get to the back of the shower and there's a 3/4 gap." So I would not put a sliver cut in there, but I did offer up putting crown molding. They have plastic crown molding, so the wood would not. If you put wood, it could possibly rot out with steam and moisture and all that stuff. And so yeah, the crown molding could take up that discrepancy at the ceiling, but he declined that. He said, I'm perfectly okay with just having that grout line up there. It bothers us, I think, more than some people. You know, we are by nature, I think, perfectionists, tilers and woodworkers, people on the creative end of it. You know, like, you want somebody to come in and not notice the mistakes that you have made. That, you know, because every tiler makes a mistake on a shower, at least 1 or 2 or 3 that they wish they hadn't done, or they wish they had done differently, you know. And 9 times out of 10, customer doesn't even notice it. We notice it more than anybody. Same process here. I'm pushing in thin set into that gap that I caused, and then I clean off the excess thin set with a sponge and then slide my Schluter strip, and it works like a charm every time. It's so easy. That way, if there's any, and if you put a level up against all of those tiles, say, you know, a 6-foot level, more than likely it won't be level. More than likely it won't be. It'll be off just a bit. Because it's not a perfect world and you're trying to deal with an imperfect build, but it looks level because I'm not putting. If I had put my strip up there first and leveled it off, and then the tile wasn't level, yeah, then every tile would have to be cut to conform. Where with this way, it doesn't have to be, and then I'm just pushing it out with little wedges there where I need to, overnight until it dries. And the part that every tiler looks forward to, the most fun part, the most exciting part of every tile job, is the grouting, he said sarcastically. This is probably the most boring, most monotonous, most time-consuming part of every tile job that we do is grouting. It's just, yeah, it's like nails on a chalkboard. It's like, yeah. We don't look forward to it, except that we know that it is the end of the job, and that's a good thing, even though we're moving on to another one. There's not much more I can say about the grouting process. There's a lot of videos on YouTube on how to grout, on how to sponge things off. You know, every tiler thinks that they have the key to make it happen, and every tiler does it a different way. You know, a lot of guys will mix up their grout in a bucket. I don't. I use that little sheetrock mud trough for my grout, so I'm mixing up the amount that I think I'll need rather than you know, mixing a wasted amount up in a bucket. But that's just me. Do I start at the bottom or the top? Generally speaking, I start at the top and work my way down to the bottom. I don't know why I'm starting at the bottom here. Maybe this is the finishing phase. Maybe my editing of this video was horrible and you're going to see me grouting again from the top going down. I don't know. I have no explanation for it. Clean water is the key. If your water gets mucked up, you know, if it was a larger shower or a smaller tile with more grout lines, make sure you swap out that water constantly. I don't mean constantly, I mean like, don't use that water, that same water, longer than, you know, say about an hour, hour and a half. It'll get mucked up too bad. So put some fresh water in there. It'll help you out. I think that's why I have 2 buckets showing there. But yeah, I'm using all 4 sides of the sponge. You don't want to over sponge grout for a lot of different reasons. The least of which is adding more moisture to the mix. That would be the least of the problem. But also because you're trying not to dig into the grout line. And the more you sponge, the more tendency you have of digging into the grout line. I think I actually did start my grouting process going from the top down. And this is the final phase of it. And this is where I'm grouting the inside part of that bottom tile where it meets the floor. I do that last along with the curb and everything, make it look pretty. Wow guys, I thought I showed on this video more of the tiling process, but I guess I didn't. You know, it's a redundancy though. So even the tiling part that you did see will give you an idea of how the rest of it's going to go anyway. But I could have sworn I showed like all 3 walls going up and all the cuts and all that stuff. This is where, yeah, last day I'm cleaning off the drain cap. I don't necessarily tape it. I know a lot of guys will do that. But, you know, there's some thin set, not thin set, grout and stuff like that. You see it all kind of mucked up on the inside. So this is where I do the cleaning phase, you know, anything that's dried up on it. Get rid of that and be careful not to scratch that drain. Yeah, that's about it. That's how to build a shower from scratch from, you know, like, I don't know what part you're watching. There are 5 parts of this build process. I think one of these videos, I think the first one or perhaps the last one, I forget how I'm going to do it, but that will be a couple of hours of the full shower build, and this will be toward the end of that video. But there are also 5 separate parts of this video. I think they run about 30-35 minutes each, and this is the last one in that series. See how pretty that is? I love those. And if you have a choice, get the better drain cap. That is a stainless steel drain cap that I use that has that nice chrome finish, and they have the cheaper ones that I don't like. Cheaper ones are little flimsy aluminum caps. I can't stand those. I think that one costs about $28, $30, whereas the other one, and when I say the cap, it's not just the cap, it's the whole drain inclusive. This is where I'm pulling out the valve stem. Because I want to flush the line. I've been on this job now for about, I think, 8 or 9 days. And when you turn the water first back on, you don't want all that nasty garbage that's inside of your water lines to get into your shower valve and all that stuff. So this is where I flush the line out. Just turn on the water, the main water a little bit, and then put the valve stem back in, put the locking pin back on that, and then all the pretty stuff follows. I don't think I flushed the line on here because it was a condo, and I think I would have had to shut down the whole building, but I did show that process of pulling out the stem. for the purposes of me telling you right now on, you know, what the best practice should be. You know, flush out your lines first before you put the valve stem in and the shower head and all that stuff. The shower head has a screen in it, and you can cut down on your water pressure by having all that mucked up stuff clog up your screen of your shower head. Every shower valve that I deal with, whether Price Fisher, Moen, Delta, they're all basically the same for me by now. That, you know, you see there's no instruction book because I figured them out already. So there's nothing much I can tell you here because I forget which one this is. I believe it's a Moen. But the process is almost the same on all of them. You know, it's putting in the valve, it's putting on the scutcheon plate, it's putting on the handle, which I'm doing there, and it usually has a little Allen screw that attaches on the inside, and I'm putting the handle on there. And then, of course, I put the shower neck on and the shower head. In this case, there is a wand type feature that has a magnetic backing on it that, you know, fits to where the shower neck comes down, which is a wonderful, wonderful idea. I love it because it has a hose on it, so it's detachable. You can use it as a shower head, or just pull off the magnetic part of that shower head, and it becomes, you know, a shower spray. And I absolutely love it. I've done about 3 of those so far, and I don't know why I get excited about them. I think they're more practical than just a plain shower head, or a shower head with a you know, with an arm on it, not an arm, you know, the elongated pole type thing where your body spray kind of runs off of, or your spray. So multifunctional, this thing. Yes, the end of channel locks. When you have a finish like this, like I have with this nickel finish, you don't want to grab that thing with your channel locks. Use the end of something rubber on the inside of that and turn it in such a way that, you know, you're as tight as you possibly can. I think I may have missed that part. Teflon tape is a very integral part when you put that shower arm on, that you want to wrap the threads with Teflon tape or pipe dope so you don't have any leakage. And here's where that spray attachment goes on with the hose. I just love this. I don't know the make and manufacturer and all that stuff. If somebody wants to know, I can find out from my customer. But yeah, that's the magnetic part at the bottom, and then you'll see how it attaches on there. It's just a wonderful, inventive idea. Inventive. I make up my own words sometimes. Yes, inside gaskets, make sure you have no leak. And that's basically it, guys. If that helped you in any way, shape, or form, then contribute to my PayPal if you can. If you can't afford that, on a one-time donation, hit my Patreon link and become a Patreon member on a monthly basis. You can support my channel because I don't make anything on YouTube.
All right. Enough of the talk already. Now I'm talking on camera. So it is finished. A job like this, whether I'm just building a shower and doing a tub to shower conversion, typically is depending on a lot of things. Depending on if it's upstairs or down in the basement, how much access I have. You know, like this is a condo. This is very difficult because of access and storage and all that stuff. But average 8 to 10 days, 8 to 10 working days, what it takes to build a shower or a tub to shower conversion. So if all I did is tear out this shower and build another shower, and the tub wasn't an issue, because it's really not, you saw how quickly I was able to take all that stuff out, then yeah, it would be about probably a 10-day job, because all this demo would be a real pain. So this is the final product. You saw me just put the valve on and all that stuff. So what I did off camera, after I started putting everything on and I had the hose out, I realized that I didn't flush the line. Sometimes things goop up inside of the plumbing and all that stuff, so when you turn the water on, it's a good idea to flush the line. That's what I did off camera, and then I just put all this pretty stuff on. This is one of those magnetic heads that I had a customer a couple of years ago that had bought one, and I thought, wow, not only is it sleek and nice looking, but it's very functional. So yeah, it's just an ingenious idea where just a very strong magnet puts it right back up. For those of you that are wondering, this is a Moen. And the Moen, Price Fisher, Delta, you know, they're all basically the same. The way I put them in, you know, I've just done so many that it's kind of like second nature. So everything is done to my customer specs. There are a couple of things you noticed earlier. To my customer specs, I went ahead and put this, what is it, this fake marble. It's not really marble, it's quartz, man-made product anyway. So I put this in, there's a nice pitch in there, and then I just kind of finish it out. I always offer when people ask me, you know, well, why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that? Because I always offer my customer different choices, and then they make the ultimate choice. So I offer to do a 45 cut, and he said, no, no big deal. I'm going to get back to this in just a minute. So because there is so much plumbing and HVAC and all this stuff in that wall, that's why we couldn't do there, so it ended up being back there. Also, and I may have mentioned it in the other video, this tile overlaps onto the curb top. For the simple fact that every tiler out there that's built in these showers knows that this is Achilles heel. Your corners are the Achilles heel, which is why I had mentioned earlier in the other video about the dam corners, because the dam corners would wrap around before all this other stuff was put on, would wrap around and make sure that water would never penetrate into this wood and all this other stuff. Having said that, the reason that it penetrated in there is because the whole curb was saturated, not just the corner. The corner looks like it's the problem, but the whole curb was the problem. The operator malfunction caused this to happen. So I mitigate that by having a wallboard there, not sitting on the floor, same as on the inside, doesn't sit on the floor. There's no wicking action that can take place. And then my wallboard is completely waterproof with RedGuard, as is my curb, as is the curb top going inside of the tile. So now water just wants to shed off. It's never going to get inside of there.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video and you learned something, consider being a Patreon member. $5, $10, $15 a month would help me greatly produce more videos. I make nothing from YouTube at all. If you're going to call me for advice, please donate $50 for 30 minutes. My link to my PayPal and my Patreon account is down below. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you get immediate notifications as soon as I post videos. And thank you very much for your support.